The rush of activity that had seen the Doors produce 2 albums in a single year rolled into 1968. The band continued to tour, playing a handful of domestic shows to promote Strange Days, while working at TTG Studios on material for a new album. Sessions had begun in December, and by March a single release was ready. Where People Are Strange had reacted to the Summer of Love with a sense of isolation, The Unknown Soldier was the first Doors track to acknowledge the growing anti-establishment concerns of the counterculture. In the first months of 1968, the Vietnam War was spiraling out of control. Not only had the US forces been thrown by the surprise attacks of the Tet Offensive, leading to an escalation of the violence, but the shocking execution of Viet Cong agent Nguyen Van Lem in February, captured by American photographer Eddie Adams, would galvanize the anti-war movement. The Unknown Soldier, the Doors' first protest song, was a brave release and one which would be immediately censored by popular radio.
Even though a lot of people have the image of the mid to late 60s, rock musicians and folk rock musicians were becoming very overt in their protest and social commentary, that happened less often than people would think. And this was a statement that it was pretty hard to miss the message that it was very anti-war. And it was a chilling reflection of the real human consequences of war in general, and probably by extension, by implication, the Vietnam War specifically. When you heard it, it was almost like, to me, this is what it feels like to have your life robbed from you for really no good reason.
Breakfast where the news is read, television, children fed, unborn living dead, bullet strikes the helmet's head.
It was relevant to the time, and I think it still holds up now, because it's not referring to Vietnam in particular. And there were protest songs, I think 2 of the more poignant ones, which were top 10 hits, were Galveston and Ruby Don't Bring Your Love to Town. They both made an allusion to a war in Asia, but they both were protesting the effects on the personal lives. It had nothing to do with why are we in Vietnam or why are we in this war. It's just this is how it's affecting these particular individuals. And The Unknown Soldier, true to the Doors, they're saying, okay, this is universal, the unknown soldier, but how is it affecting you?
If you're talking about use of music concrete, which I think is much more arresting than Horse Latitudes, I would say the middle section of Unknown Soldier is like that. The fact that they chose that as a single, I think that might have been a very deliberate choice. Like, yeah, we have Hello, I Love You from this album, which is going to be a #1 hit, and it's relatively innocuous. We also have this. We know it's not going to be a top 10 single. We know that a lot of stations aren't going to play this, but we're going to get it out there because some people will play it.
And live, the band brought a new dimension to the track. Their training in filmmaking finally coming to the fore, Morrison and Manzarek produced and directed a promo film to accompany the song, and they premiered this at the end of March during their seminal gigs at the Fillmore East in New York.
It was intended from the first that film should somehow play a part in what it was that they were going to be doing, you know, as far as rock goes. You can't imagine the impact that that had at the Fillmore East, seeing that for the first time. People just did not know quite what to make of it. They were gobsmacked, as you Brits like to put it. It was extraordinary. It was just extraordinary. I forget what the song they played before it was, but they just all put down their instruments and they filed off stage very neatly, and then this came up on the light show screen, and nobody had ever seen anything like it.
Make a grave for the unknown soldier, nestled in your hollow shoulder.
Nobody had ever seen anything like that. Even people who were used to the Velvet Underground and the kind of stuff, and Yoko was getting into a lot of stuff here, that arty, poetic kind of scene, which Jim really, really was drawn to. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before here, and maybe that was commonplace in California, but we somehow didn't think it was. When they came back out again, it was almost as if you can't come back out, you're dead. You know, you shouldn't be out here again. It was that powerful.
Yet, unpredictable as ever, the Doors followed their most controversial single with their most commercial. And where both radio censorship and a lack of pop convention meant that The Unknown Soldier had just brushed the singles charts, Hello, I Love You, released in June, would become their second #1 hit and would eventually sell over 1 million copies.
Good song. Good song, sure. I'll take it. And you know, by that time, you know, people, first people would say, oh, you're being too pretentious, and then he did this, you're not being pretentious enough. You know, it wasn't Break On Through, I'll say that. See, Break On Through is, I'm sorry, first song, first album, their peak. Did both at the same time. But I love Hello, I Love You. Pop vulnerability that was built into the voice, even though it wasn't in the persona that much, really works very well on that song. It's a very effective piece of pop music, very pop song.
And it was this slice of pop that broke the Doors in other territories. While they had quickly conquered their homeland, in Europe the band were all but unknown. Both commercially and controversially, Hello, I Love You would rectify that situation.
Light My Fire wasn't even remotely a hit in Britain. Big hit for Jose Feliciano, of course. I mean, he was the one who had the massive hit with it sometime later. So the breakthrough for the Doors was very much delayed. It's not until Hello, I Love You that they finally have their first hit in Britain. Up until that point, there were what would have then been called an underground group. Hello, I Love You sort of momentarily transformed them into a pop group. But of course it didn't come without controversy, and I remember hearing it for the first time. I can even remember the disc jockey who played it. It was the late Stuart Henry, and you know, he said, this is a new record by the Doors and it's called Hello, I Love You, will you tell me your name? As if it was quite a strange thing, and then he proceeded to play it. And I was shocked. I heard it a couple of times pretty soon after, and I'd never heard a record that was so imitative of another record before. To me, it was just a blatant copy of All Day and All of the Night by the Kings. I mean, it wasn't even subtle about it. I'd never heard two records that sounded so similar. And the first instinct upon hearing it was, oh, God, are they allowed to do that?
I'm not content to be with you in the daytime.
I remember going into school and discussing it, even the kids that would have been maybe 14 or something, that knew little about pop music or anything else. They had ears, and that was it was as blatant as that. It was actually quite shocking because, years later when you listen to the record, you can put it in a larger context of that riff being, distinctive from, maybe you can talk about the Kingsmen and you can talk about those garage groups and all the rest of it. But I'm telling you, at the time that was played, I had never ever heard one record that sounded so similar to another.
Despite the controversy, the single's success propelled the band further into the mainstream, and commercially, if not critically, the Doors were going from strength to strength. 3 sellout shows at the Hollywood Bowl followed in July, and a week later, the band's third album, Waiting for the Sun, was released.
I think Waiting for the Sun is interesting in a lot of ways. I think, it is the difficult third album that critics talk about for bands. Usually your first album, you spent a lot of years writing that material, and the second album, you still got some of that great material you worked on for years, and the third album, you kind of crank out while you're on the road, so they tend to suffer. But also, there's some very commercial type tracks in there, which, some critics responded to as almost selling out. Songs like Hello, I Love You seem overtly commercial, but they also have kind of a strangeness to them. And I think one of the reasons, I think they were suffering a little bit. I mean, the success and the drugs were starting to catch up, and the alcohol, certainly in Jim's case. But also at that time, I think it was like saying, all right, well, we'll go for some things that are really different here, too. And I think that's how The Unknown Soldier and some of the other tracks on there. So it's a strange blend, because you can't say, oh, this is just an attempt at a raw commercial album, because it's not.
Waiting for a Son is a very unusual record in the Doors' discography because at the time, if you read reviews and even some critical assessments now, it was considered something of a disappointment. It wasn't a commercial failure. It was a #1 record in the States. As songwriters, they didn't have as big a pool of great material to draw from. I think it's an erratic record, but I think the high points are really high. And that in itself, because the Doors' high points are much higher than most other bands, makes it a worthwhile record. I think The Unknown Soldier is one of their greatest achievements. And 5 to 1 is not one of my favorite songs maybe, but it's a very interesting song in that they're getting into more direct social commentary than they usually did.
Arithmetic, which suggests that there are 5 times more young people living than there were middle-aged or elder people at the time, which is probably spurious anyway, but it works for the rhetoric. And it's that never trust anyone over 30 dictum which was doing the rounds at the time, and the absolute belief that youth was the new wisdom, and anybody over the age of 30 was old hat and should be disposed of as soon as possible. It was sort of hippie-ish in a sense, and yet at the same time anticipated the political rhetoric of 1968 too. Same message in Street Fighting Man, in Revolution, in all those songs at the time. It's all about overthrowing the old order and establishing something new. What that something new is and how it will function, of course, is not addressed in the song. It's just a simple sloganeering rallying cry.
Artistically spectacular albums, and they expect the same the next one. That's a disservice. I mean, the Doors had created 2 very beautiful albums. Give them a break. You just can't keep creating that stuff nonstop. They gave you good music, they'll get back to it. But contract said deliver music. But there was still this desire to try something different. The Spanish Caravan, that's a wonderful guitar lick. Oh, how they opens that up. And then, again, the artistic vision. When you get that guitar lick come back, it's now electronic. And it's just driving right through you. It's no longer this pleasant, let's go off on the Spanish Caravan. No, there's some danger out here. And here comes this guitar just ripping through that same lick.
Waiting for the Sun, which has often been derided by certain critics as being a failure or a commercial sellout. It is interesting that there are these subtle tracks that are going on in there that aren't simply poppy. It's not just Hello, I Love You Mark II and a few pop songs, and a sense that it's unfocused and is trying to be a pop album when the other 2 were, I suppose, to use that term, underground albums, or they were trying to make some kind of big artistic statement. It seems that Waiting for the Sun has been dismissed as a compromise of sorts. My Wild Love is different. It sounds not just Native American to me, it also, it sounds like a chain gang song. It's got a nautical element in it as well, so it's almost like slaves on a ship. Simply the Spanish Caravan and strong guitar flamenco style, I think it's a very strong and interesting composition. I think there's a lot more going on in that album than probably they've been given credit for, and I think as a whole it's actually not, it's a pretty good album. It just doesn't have quite the artistic ambition of its 2 predecessors.
Yet the ambition was there. It was simply not delivered on the final record. To the band's disappointment, they had failed to record a satisfactory version of The Celebration of the Lizard, a long song suite that was intended to fill an entire side of the record. The only element of the suite included on Waiting for the Sun was the track Not to Touch the Earth.
Jim Morrison was getting so untogether in some aspects of his behavior. He wasn't easy to work with in the studio and get the best performance out of. And when you're doing, they were thinking it was going to be like 24 minutes, a suite to combine these things, you have to work very, very hard to make that stuff come together in the studio, I think. And I don't think they could get that level of dedication and commitment from Morrison, which was very frustrating for the other band members. Also, I think this is something that has to be pointed out. I don't think the parts of Celebration of the Lizard that have survived, that we can hear and judge, I don't really think they're that great. And I certainly don't think they fit together very well. I think they might have been biting off more than they could chew. Maybe it sounded great, like we'll have this 24-minute opus, but actually the songs, the elements themselves weren't that great, and the whole idea of whatever they were celebrating, it was actually kind of ludicrous.
Not to touch the earth, not to see the sun, nothing left to do but run, run.